Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The silence after midnight holds secrets. Scary story, published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1, Midnight Whispers. I pulled up to the house just before sunset. The late summer air clung to me, thick and oppressive, as I killed the engine and stepped out of the car. There it stood, the old Victorian at the edge of town, wrapped in peeling white paint and covered in creeping ivy. A fresh start, I told myself. A chance to leave the chaos of the city behind. Yet, standing on that cracked, uneven porch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was wrong. The locals had been friendly enough at first. Friendly in that small town, curious about the new girl kind of way. They hadn't said much about the house when I signed the papers, just nervous glances, quick smiles. When I pressed for details, they always deflected, mentioning things like old history or bad luck, but never anything concrete. It was the silence that unnerved me. The way they fell quiet when I asked about the house's last owner. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of time gone by. The wood floors creaked with every step as I moved from room to room, taking in the dusty curtains, the chipped wallpaper. The house felt abandoned, untouched for years. But it was mine now, a place to finally put the past behind me, or so I hoped. That night, after a dinner of takeout and too many glasses of wine, I settled into bed, pulling the heavy quilt up to my chin. The silence pressed in from all sides, broken only by the occasional creak of the old walls. But as the clock struck midnight, I awoke with a start. There was a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but no, it was something else. The sound was soft, distant, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere deep within the house, like someone speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. I lay frozen in bed, every nerve on high alert. My heart raced, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The house settling, maybe. Old wood, old pipes. I was just jumpy, still adjusting to the quiet of this place. The city had been noisy, alive, a constant hum of life. Here, the silence seemed to have a weight to it, like it was hiding something just out of sight. I forced myself to sleep, but the unease lingered, settling deep into my bones. The next morning, I told myself it had just been my imagination. The remnants of a nightmare, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here. The house felt off. And that whisper, it wasn't going away. Chapter 2, Silent Visitors. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the room. I sat up in bed, my mind still foggy from the restless night. The whisper. It had been real, hadn't it? I tried to shake off the lingering sense of dread, but it clung to me like the stale air of the house. Coffee, that's what I needed. Something to ground me, to make me feel like I was still in control. After making a cup, I wandered through the house, my fingers trailing along the dusty banisters and cracked wallpaper. The house was massive, much larger than I'd originally thought. As I explored, I noticed doors I hadn't seen before. One led to a narrow, winding staircase that descended into what appeared to be a cellar. The air grew colder as I moved further into the depths of the house. It was in the basement that I found the first real sign that something was off. Tucked away in the corner was an old, crumbling box filled with yellowed papers and photographs. Most were too faded to make out clearly, but one photo caught my eye, a black and white image of a family standing on the very porch I had walked across the day before. The man in the photo stood tall and stern, his face half obscured by a shadow, while the woman clutched a small child. But something about the photo sent a chill through me. Their eyes were blurred, like they'd been erased by time itself. I shoved the picture back into the box and climbed out of the basement, my heart racing. There was something wrong with this house. The thought wouldn't leave my head. The whispers from the night before echoed faintly in my ears, as if the house was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. The days were fine calm even. Sunshine filtered through the windows, making everything seem almost normal. But as night fell and the quiet settled back in, the feeling returned. That sense of being watched. Each night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Objects I'd left in one place would move to another. Doors I swore I'd shut were open when I returned to them. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd been careless, distracted. But the feeling of something watching me, only grew stronger. By the end of the week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers. At the local grocery store, I approached the cashier, a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes. I casually mentioned the house, hoping for some clarity. But when I brought it up, her smile faltered. Her eyes darted to the side, and she mumbled something about not knowing much before quickly changing the subject. It wasn't just her. Every person I asked grew uncomfortable the moment the house came up, their voices tight, their eyes avoiding mine. No one wanted to talk about it, but the silence around the subject only made my paranoia grow. Whatever they were hiding, I had the sinking feeling that it was far worse than I could imagine. And the whispers, they weren't going away. They were only getting louder. Chapter 3, The Past Resurfaces. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the townsfolk avoided my questions. Every sidelong glance, every mumbled deflection only fed the gnawing suspicion that had been building since the first night in this house. Something had happened here, something they all knew but refused to speak about. I spent hours poring over local archives, scouring old newspaper clippings and town records. It took time, but I finally found a name, the Hollis family. They'd lived in the house before me, but nearly 12 years ago, they vanished without a trace. No explanations, no leads, just gone. Town had buried the story as quickly as they could, pretending it hadn't happened. But the whispers, the ones I heard at night, they felt connected, like the house itself was desperate for me to understand what had been hidden. The more I learned, the less I slept. The midnight whispers no longer startled me awake. They were louder now, almost conversational, as if a distant conversation was happening just out of earshot. And then the footsteps began. At first, they were faint, barely more than a suggestion of sound. But night after night, they grew heavier, closer. They circled the house, stopping just outside my bedroom door. I found symbols scratched into the walls one morning. Primitive, jagged lines, like something out of an old, forgotten language. They weren't there before I was sure of it. I scrubbed them clean, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. Lack of sleep does things to people. But the next morning, they were back, deeper this time, as though something was etching them in with intent. By day, I tried to convince myself I was imagining it all, that the sleepless nights were eroding my sanity. But by night, the house unraveled me. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable, a constant weight pressing on my chest. One evening, I decided to go for a walk through the house, hoping to ground myself in some way. As I reached the staircase, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced at the walls. More symbols had appeared, their meaning still elusive, but now covering the hallway like a warning I couldn't understand. I started to turn back toward my room when the air grew cold. It wasn't the typical night chill, it was something deeper, a bone-deep cold that made the air feel heavy. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, Just at the edge of the faint moonlight filtering through the window stood a figure. Tall, barely more than a shadow, but undeniably there. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Its presence was suffocating, the darkness around it almost tangible. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My body screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. It was waiting for something, and I realized so was I. The whispers had led me to this, and now they wanted me to listen. Chapter 4: Unseen Eyes. The figure was there again, standing at the end of the hallway, just like the night before. The cold crept into my bones as I stared at it, waiting for it to move, to do something, anything. But it didn't. It just watched, a silhouette darker than the shadows surrounding it. Its presence, though silent, felt like a scream echoing in the back of my mind. Every night it came, midnight. Always at midnight. I would hear the faint footsteps first, then the whispers guttural, almost inaudible, as if the house itself were murmuring in the darkness. And then, without fail, the figure would appear, unmoving, watching me with unseen eyes. But it never stepped forward, never crossed the threshold into my room. I'd begun counting the days since I last felt normal, but the line between day and night blurred. The figure's constant presence stripped away my sense of time, of safety. I couldn't sleep anymore, not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear its breath, feel its gaze on my back. It was driving me mad, pushing me deeper into isolation. I stopped calling people. No one in the town believed me, and I could see it in their eyes when I'd try to explain. They thought I was just another outsider losing my mind in this old house. But it wasn't just the house. Something was wrong either with me or with this place, and I was the only one left to figure it out. The solitude gnawed at me, hollowing out my insides until I was left with nothing but my fear. I wandered through the house like a ghost myself, moving from room to room, desperate to understand what was happening. I had no one to turn to, no one to share this nightmare with. The figure never spoke, never gave me answers. But the whispers, it was like they were trying to tell me something, and I couldn't understand the language. As the days wore on, memories from my past began resurfacing, memories I thought I'd buried for good. Back in the city, I had lived through my own horror. A stalker had followed me for months, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. I had escaped him, or at least I thought I had. But now, with the constant feeling of being watched in this house, I couldn't help but wonder if it had ever really ended. Could he have followed me here? Was this some sick game he was playing, using the house's haunting presence to torment me? Every night, the whispers grew louder. And then one night, they changed. It wasn't the house anymore. The figure it spoke. I heard my name, clear as day, slithering through the silence. "Emily," it whispered, "Emily." My breath caught in my throat. I sat up in bed, my eyes darting to the hallway, but the figure was already there, standing in the shadows as always. A knock echoed from the floor. My eyes dropped to the space beneath the door. A piece of paper slid into my room, its edges jagged, as though ripped in a hurry. With shaking hands, I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the short message. "You'll never escape the silence." The figure didn't move. But now, it didn't have to. It had spoken. Chapter 5: The Midnight Pact. The note trembled in my hands. "You'll never escape the silence." The words felt like a curse etched into my mind, echoing in the darkness that had gripped the house and me. That night, the figure watched longer than usual, lingering in the shadows as if waiting for something. I could hardly breathe. The next morning, desperate for answers, I began searching every inch of the house. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, some clue, some explanation for the madness that had taken root here. That's when I found the attic. a creaky old door, tucked behind a large bookshelf, one I hadn't noticed before. It groaned open, as if it hadn't been touched in years, releasing a cloud of dust into the stale air. The attic was cramped, filled with forgotten relics of the past, cobweb-covered trunks, worn furniture, and stacks of old books. But one thing stood out, a single journal sitting on top of an old chest. The pages were yellowed, the ink smudged with time, but it was unmistakably the journal of the last Hollis family member. I sat on the floor, the dim light from the small attic window barely enough to read by, and flipped through the pages. It was as though I had stepped into the mind of someone living my exact nightmare. The words were frantic, almost erratic, describing strange occurrences in the house, whispers in the night, shadows watching from the corners, objects moving on their own. It was all there, everything I had been experiencing. But it was the final entries that chilled me to the core. They spoke of a pact, a deal made with some unknown force that haunted the house. According to the journal, the entity would appear at midnight, waiting in the silence, feeding off the fear of those trapped inside. The house, it seemed, was nothing more than a vessel for this dark force, a prison for its victims. The Hollis family had succumbed to it, just as I feared I might. My heart pounded as I read the last lines scrawled in the journal. Once you hear your name, it's too late. The words burned into my thoughts. My name, the figure had spoken my name. Was I doomed like the Hollis family? Every rational part of me wanted to believe it was just a hallucination, a result of my fragile mind breaking down. But the deeper I went, the more I realized I couldn't ignore the signs. The house was alive, and it was hungry. I made up my mind to leave. I couldn't stay another night in this cursed place. But when I tried to leave, the world twisted in on itself. The roads that led out of town seemed to fold back, looping like some cruel joke, forcing me to return to the house. I'd drive for hours, only to find myself pulling up to the front gate again and again. Panic set in. Was this the entity's doing? Or was I losing my grip on reality entirely? The harder I fought to escape, the stronger the force inside the house became. The air itself felt heavier, oppressive. I couldn't run. The house, it wouldn't let me. And the silence after midnight? It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was something far more sinister, something waiting to strike. I could feel it creeping closer, pulling me deeper into its grasp. Chapter 6. The Silence Breaks. The house felt different now, more alive, more oppressive. The silence was no longer a mere absence of sound. It felt sentient, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Each night, the figure grew bolder. What had once been a distant, shadowy presence at the far end of the hallway now loomed closer, closer. It no longer just watched. It whispered, a sickening melody of promises and lies. "Join us," it said, the voice a chorus of hushed tones that echoed in my skull long after midnight had passed. "Freedom is yours, if you give in." But I knew what that meant. The journal had made it clear. Giving in wasn't freedom. It was entrapment, a binding to whatever malevolent force controlled this place. Each night, the whispers grew louder, their promises more alluring, as if the house knew my resolve was weakening. But I couldn't give in. I wouldn't. Still, the weight of the isolation, the constant pressure of being hunted, began to take its toll. I wasn't the same Emily who had stepped into this house weeks ago, hoping for a fresh start. My mind had hardened, my nerves steeled by fear. I knew now that running wasn't an option. This thing, whatever it was, wouldn't stop until I confronted it. On the 7th night, I stood at the top of the staircase, waiting. Midnight struck, and the familiar hush settled over the house like a suffocating blanket. I gripped the banister, my heart pounding, as I saw the figure materialize once again at the far end of the hall. But this time, it wasn't content to stay in the shadows. It moved toward me, slow, deliberate steps that echoed in the unnatural silence. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling despite my attempt at bravery. The figure stopped just a few feet away. For the first time, I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its features were blurred, shifting like smoke, an amalgamation of countless faces, all twisted in pain and fear. "We are the silence," it whispered back, the voices overlapping, a terrifying chorus of lost souls. "We are all who were claimed by this place." I staggered backward, bile rising in my throat. The truth crashed over me like a tidal wave. This thing wasn't just a ghost. It was a manifestation of every soul the house had consumed. Each person who had stepped inside, heard the whispers, and lost themselves to the darkness, now formed part of the entity that stood before me. "The house feeds on fear," it said, stepping closer. "Your fear makes us stronger." I clung to the banister, my mind racing. I had been feeding it each sleepless night, every time I'd flinched at a whisper or seen a shadow. My terror had strengthened it. But even as I tried to push that realization away, another horror surfaced. Beneath the cacophony of voices, I heard one that sent chills down my spine. My own. "Give in, Emily," the whisper came, soft but unmistakable. "You belong here." I froze, heart hammering in my chest. My own voice, echoing from the silence, pleading for surrender. For a moment, I felt the pull, the seductive promise of escape from this waking nightmare. All I had to do was stop fighting. But deep down, I knew the truth. Giving in meant becoming part of them, forever trapped in the silence of midnight. Just another soul lost to the house. The figure reached out, its form solidifying, as if it were ready to claim me. My breath hitched, and I realized there was no more running. If I was going to survive, I would have to fight. But how do you fight something that is both everywhere and nowhere? Something that thrives on the very fear you're trying to suppress? The whispers grew louder, relentless. My own voice among them, telling me to let go. Chapter 7. The Final Midnight. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the house. The impending night felt heavier than any before it, as if the house itself was bracing for what was to come. I could barely keep my hands from shaking as I prepared for the showdown I'd been dreading. The journal had given me some clues, ancient symbols, words of power meant to summon the entity in its full form. I had copied them onto a piece of parchment, now lying in the center of the living room floor, surrounded by candles whose flickering light did little to dispel the encroaching darkness. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the house seemed to hold its breath. The oppressive silence was almost unbearable. I paced the room, my nerves frayed, every creak and groan of the house amplifying the tension. The whispers had been relentless, growing louder with each passing hour. Finally, the clock struck 12. Candles flared, their flames stretching toward the ceiling, and the house trembled as if awakening from a deep slumber. The shadows twisted, warping around me as the entity revealed itself in all its horror. It was no longer just a figure, but a grotesque amalgamation of all those who had come before me, faces contorted in agony, voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair. "You've come to understand," the entity's voice boomed, reverberating through the walls. "But the silence after midnight is my domain. It feeds on the despair of those trapped here, and you are no different from the others." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The house wasn't merely haunted. It was a trap designed to feed on the fear of its occupants. The entity thrived in the silence, a darkness that devoured not just souls, but hope itself. My fate had been sealed the moment I stepped inside. The only way to escape was to surrender or destroy the house, an impossible choice. The shadows of the previous victims, their twisted forms moving with an unnatural grace, began to close in on me. Their eyes, hollow and mournful, seemed to pierce through my very being, making the house seem to contract and expand, warping reality itself. I grabbed a heavy lamp from a nearby table, the metal cool and solid in my hand, and prepared for a last-ditch effort to fight back. If I couldn't escape, I would have to destroy this hellish place, even if it meant taking my chances with whatever lay beyond. The house was alive, a malevolent entity that thrived on despair. I had to act fast, or I would become just another lost soul, another whisper in the silence. The walls groaned and the floor buckled as I swung the lamp, shattering the nearest candle. The darkness surged, threatening to engulf me. Shadows reached out, clawing at my legs, pulling me toward the center of the room where the entity waited. I fought against the pull, my mind racing as the house seemed to close in around me. In the dim light, I saw the journal's symbols start to glow. With a final cry of defiance, I threw the lamp at the shadows, shattering the silence with a loud crash. The house screamed, a sound of pure agony, and the walls seemed to tremble as the entity's form writhed and twisted. As the entity's figure began to dissolve into the darkness, I realized the truth: there might be no escape. But if I could tear this place apart, maybe, just maybe, I could sever its grip and free whatever souls it had consumed, including my own. Chapter 8: Secrets in the Silence. The house roared with fury as the flames consumed it. Each crackle of the fire felt like a release, a violent, cathartic end to the nightmare I had endured. The walls groaned and buckled, sending showers of embers and ash into the night sky. I watched from a safe distance, my heart pounding as the house, the entity, and the suffocating silence seemed to dissolve into the inferno. With each step I took away from the blaze, a flicker of hope ignited in my chest. The darkness was retreating, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that I had finally won. The house, the curse, it was all being reduced to ashes. I turned away from the fire, eager to escape and never look back. My legs felt heavy, each step laden with the weight of relief and exhaustion. But as I walked through the deserted streets, the world around me grew unsettlingly quiet. The familiar noises of the night, distant traffic, the rustling of leaves had vanished. It was as if the entire world had been muffled, swallowed by an oppressive hush that mirrored the silence of the house. My breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the creeping sensation of unease that slithered up my spine. I arrived at my new apartment, a temporary refuge I had hoped would be a sanctuary from my recent horrors. I collapsed onto the couch, trying to shake off the remnants of fear that clung to me. The silence was deafening, a void that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I glanced at the clock, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a fleeting sense of normalcy. But as the clock struck midnight, the familiar whispers began. They started softly, just as they had in the house, but quickly grew louder, more insistent. My blood ran cold as I recognized the voices, my own voice among them, pleading, whispering, accusing. The whispers filled the room, wrapping around me like a shroud. My heart raced as I realized the horrifying truth. The curse hadn't been tied to the house. It had been tied to me all along. The silence after midnight was not a result of the house. It was a presence that had latched onto me, following me wherever I went. The house had merely been a vessel, a stage for the true horror that was now an inescapable part of my existence. The room seemed to close in on me, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. I could no longer distinguish between the sounds of the house and echoes in my mind. I had thought destroying the house would end the torment, but instead it had only set the stage for something far more insidious. Tears welled in my eyes as the realization sank in. There was no escape from the silence. I had tried to outrun it, but it had followed me, enveloping my life in a darkness more profound than I had ever imagined. The whispers swirled around me, a chilling reminder that the true horror lay not in the house, but in the silent depths of my own mind.